Thank you very much, Mike. So I'm going to talk about spike coding for sound, and spike coding for sound perception in particular. And I'm going to say, and this work is joined with lots of people, it's done over quite a long period of time, including Mike Newton, Magical High, Andrew Abel, and quite a number of other people as well. So I'm going to say a little bit about sound coding, spike coding, a very brief review about that. Say something about spike-based coding and why one might be interested in that, particularly for sound. Then I'm going to talk about onsets for a while. I seem to have spent a lot of my time working on onsets over the last 10-15 years, saying how to implement them and why one might want to. That takes me into a bit of what I did with, that Mike did with me, that's a better way around putting it, on musical instrument identification. And then look at some work on adaptive sound feature creation, which is what I'm working on at the moment, although I don't really have enough time to do enough work on it, and then say a bit more about current work and ways forward. So part one is about coding the sound. So those of you from any kind of background will be familiar with this kind of picture. The top one being a graph against time of essentially pressure wave of a piece of sound, a little bit of speech. Usually turned directly into an electrical signal, a voltage signal by a microphone, and the bottom one is a spectral graph of the same piece of sound, time going along the x-axis, frequency going up the y-axis logarithmically, and the colour representing the intensity at that frequency. And that's a kind of standard view of sound. And the way in which it's usually used, or has been used traditionally in engineering, particularly in the speech community, is to work with these mel frequency step-stroke coefficients, which are a way of coding this particular speech sound. You take a Fourier transform, fast Fourier transform, you take the spectrum, you do mel scale filtering, you take the log of it, you do a discrete cosine transform on it, that gives you step-stroke coefficients, and you end up with a feature vector. It's a nice technique, it's very effective, it's been used a lot for speech recognition, and it summarises sound in a relatively short vector, one per time interval. And that time interval might be 25, 30 milliseconds, and it might be overlapping. So that's a standard way of doing things. So why do I want to go away from that? What's wrong with that? Well, essentially what I criticise in this, and what's missing from it, is time, or timing, or precise timing, perhaps a better way of putting it. So the precision of the time precision of the vectors in MFCC vectors depends how often they're calculated, depends how often you recalculate your Fourier transform, 25, 30 milliseconds. So that gives you a degree of precision which is like a 40th of a second, which is not terribly precise. And the precision of it also depends on the number of elements used. You lose essentially what I'm going to describe as a fine time structure of the sound. You lose any information about the sound, about the timing of the sound within these 25 millisecond blocks. And I'm suggesting that's an issue. The other thing that's wrong with MFCC, and this is more difficult in some ways, more difficult to get around, is that you're interpreting the MFCC vectors directly. So that means that you take the microphone and you generate your MFCCs, and then you take the whole sound of that and you interpret it. And the problem with that is that where that's not a problem is where you've got a microphone sitting in front of you here with a nice 40, 50 decibel signal to noise ratio and little reverberation. Or rather, you've got the microphone maybe 30 centimetres in front of your mouth and the reverberation is a long way down. In most environments, like this room here, for example, reverberation is really quite considerable. There isn't a lot of extraneous noise in here, but we're used to working with extraneous noise a lot. In the building I'm working in at the moment, they're building another building just outside it, and there's plenty of extraneous noise there. So that's fine if you've got a good, well-placed microphone and not very much reverberation and so forth. And clearly the MFCC is not invertible. You can't go back to the sound, you can't recreate the sound from the MFCC, and I'll come back to that. So, can we get some kind of inspiration from the biology? So, I'm going to briefly go into the biology of hearing, just very briefly, because we want to spend a whole hour just talking about that. So we've got the outer ear, or the pinna, and then we have the auditory canal, and then we have an impedance transformation through the bones of the middle ear, and that also is adaptive. Its transmission can be reduced to make loud sounds quieter, and that goes from there into the cochlea, and the cochlea then is where the actual sound is converted. So the pressure wave from these the bones of the middle ear turns into a pressure wave inside the cochlea, and that's detected in turn by the organ of Corti and sent down the cochlear nerve to the brainstem. Slicing through the cochlea, you get the pictorial membrane and the basilar membrane, and then you have the inner hair cells whose movement causes changes at the connection between the cochlear nerve fibers and the inner hair cells and the outer hair cells, which are used to adjust the precise way in which this works. And there's a whole literature on the precise way in which this has been put together. There's lots of states in the middle, of course. So that's fine, okay. If you look in more detail at the organ of Corti itself, and the actual part that does this changing from the pressure wave, from the movement into the sound itself, into the neural signal, then it happens essentially here at this inner hair cell. The outer hair cells are transmitting devices, the inner hair cells are a receiving device, and that thing goes into these nerve fibers. And right down at the inner hair cells themselves, the signal is generated by the movement of these tiny hairs, these kinocilia, the stereocilia, at the very end of the inner hair cell. And that opens and closes very rapidly changing ionic channels, and results eventually in changes happening down here at the synapse onto the afferent nerve, and that then the axons of that nerve become the axons of that nerve become the auditory nerve. The axons of those cochlear nerves become the auditory nerve. So you can look at the auditory nerve response. For loud sounds, it's fairly wideband, and as the sound gets quieter, the cue of these filters increases enormously, much more sharply tuned. So one thing you can say about the cochlea is that it's anything but a static, simple filter bank. It's an adaptive filter bank which is altering the way in which it works, depending on what comes back to it. Now, I've not modelled that, but I'd love to. What I am interested in, though, is the phase response of the auditory nerve fibre. And the point here is that the movement of these stereocilia changes what's happening here, but it's fast enough that up to about 2 kilohertz or so in humans, the signals on the auditory nerve are more or less in phase with the signal. So a lot of fine time structure exists in the spikes on the auditory nerve. At high frequencies, 5-6 kilohertz, that's lost. At low frequencies it's present. In cats it's maintained to a somewhat higher frequency than it is in humans, but it's clearly, it's used inside the brainstem, it's used. So, in a way, I'm trying to justify going for more of the fine time structure by what's happening on the auditory nerve itself. Because there's nothing like that whatsoever in the MFCC type signals. It loses everything below 25 milliseconds resolution. Whereas here, we have things down to something like 300-400 microsecond resolution. So what I've been interested in is taking an engineering approach to this. What can we do that will give us something from this? So the basic way in which I've been working is to start with a microphone, digitize it, put it through a digital filter bank using the gamma-tone filter bank, and then encode these signals that are coming out as spikes using a set of zero-crossing spike encoders. So what that gives me is for each different bandpass channel, for each of these channels, I get a set of spike trains. Now, the other thing about the auditory nerve is that some of the auditory nerve fibres are what are called high spontaneous rate fibres, and they respond to quiet signals, but then for louder signals, they're just completely responding all the time. You're not coding any information there. And then you have low spontaneous rate fibres, which don't really fire until the signal gets quite loud. And in that way, the cochlea is able to cope with a fairly large dynamic range of sound. In fact, our ears cope with something like 130 decibels dynamic range of sound, or 110 decibels of dynamic range of sound, partly through what's happening in the middle ear, and partly through what's happening in the cochlea, and partly through the adaptive nature of the cochlear filter. So I want to generate spike trains, but if I'm not careful, I'm going to generate a spike train which only can code signals over a small dynamic range. So for each bandpass filter, I generate a number of different spike trains, some of which spike even when the signal is quite small, some of which spike when the signal is a bit bigger, and some of which only spike when the signal is bigger again. And I have set them up in such a way that the spikes occur on positive going zero crossings. So in that sense, the spikes are amplitude coded. We've got a set of spikes that give you an amplitude coding. And if we look at what happens there and plot multiple bands that way, time that way, and the size of the spike train, or the number of spike trains here, you get something that actually looks very like a spectrogram. So I've taken this approach out of some degree of biological inspiration. Up to 2 to 4 kilohertz, the auditory nerve does synchronize to the waveform, and then I'm using this coding to maintain precise timing. It's reasonably efficient. I've got a sequence of spike trains, one per frequency band, and it kind of works and I can do things with it. I've been using this for a while now. And this is what it looks like, kind of expanded out a bit. This is what it looks like, expanded out a bit more. Okay, so that's a representation. I've got a large number of spike trains. I have a set of spike trains for each band, and maybe I've got 50 bands or 100 bands, and then I've got a set of spike trains for each band, so maybe I've got 50 or 100 bands, and then within each band I might have 8, 12 or 16 spike trains. So I end up with something like 600, 800 different spike trains. So what do I do with this representation? We haven't got this representation, we think, well, okay, that's all very well, but what can you do with it? So, more or less in the opposite order from what I've done in reality with this, I'm going to talk first of all about some work that Madhu Pahar, who's a recent PhD from Stirling, did. And he was looking at the invertibility of this particular coding. Remember, I said earlier that one thing you can say for sure about the MFCC coding is that it's not invertible. So maybe invertibility is interesting to look at. The other thing I'm going to look at is using onsets or finding onsets using this coding, and maybe other useful features too. So one thing we did was to look at simply recreating the signal. So here's the original
Don't
signal.
ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
Anybody who's worked with Tim would be familiar with that?
Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
So this was done using a fairly large number of bands and a fairly large number of
Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
male, female,
An oily rag like that.
start at the beginning.
Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
Okay, so then you become interested in what happens if you reduce the number of channels. What happens if you reduce the number of sensitivity levels? So here, I think it's the same sound, is it?
Don't ask me
It
to
is.
carry an oily rag
That's
like
the
that.
original. And here we have it.
Don't ask
Oops.
me to carry an oily rag like that.
Here we have it with 50 channels and 16 sensitivity levels.
Don't ask me
That's
to
pretty
carry an
good.
oily rag like that.
And then we can have it with 8
Don't
channels,
ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
25 channels and 8 sensitivity levels, 12 channels and 8 sensitivity
Don't
levels,
ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
6 channels and 8,
Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
8 channels and 6 sensitivity levels, and gradually it gets worse.
Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
Until we get down to this sort of level.
You can carry an oily rag like that.
And then right from the beginning. This is. So it degrades in a sensible kind of way. It degrades effectively in a way that you can hear how it's degrading, but certainly even for relatively small numbers of channels like 8 and let's say 6 sensitivity levels,
Don't ask
it
me
still
to
works
carry
really
an oily
quite
rag
well.
like that.
So it's really quite robust. It's a reasonably robust system, this. You don't need 50 or 100 channels. You don't need 16. You don't need 16 sensitivity levels. You just need a relatively small number to maintain it. So that suggests that this kind of technique is maintaining something useful from the signal. It suggests that. It suggests that maybe what we're picking out from the biological plausibility is perhaps the right kind of thing to pick out from it. Okay, so now I'm going to say a bit about onsets. I've been interested in onsets for a long time. I've been interested in onsets because, well, there's a number of reasons. The first one is that in the biological system, if you look at anything in the auditory system, it's generally very sensitive to onsets. All the way from the auditory nerve itself, through to different kinds of multipolar cells inside the cochlea nucleus, which is where the auditory nerve arrives, through lots of other cells inside the auditory midbrain, all the way up to the auditory cortex. So that's one reason for being interested in them. Another reason for being interested in them is that, let's say in a room like this, most of the volume of what you're hearing from me is coming from reflections. If this was an anechoic chamber, my voice, given I was talking at the same level, would be quieter. So much of the volume comes from the reverberation. But the part of the sound that you can hear from my voice that arrives first is the part that comes from the direct path, because that's the shortest path. And there's been a lot of work on called the law of the first wavefront that shows that you're very sensitive to that, particularly for finding the direction of sound. Sounds quite interesting in the sense that you're usually interested in the direction that the sound source is in. And that's completely different to vision. In vision, you're interested in where the reflections come from. In sound, by and large, you're not interested in where the reflections come from. You're interested in where the sound source is. I mean, in vision, you're not interested in the lights are over there. That's neither here nor there. You're interested in the way the light reflects off me. You're interested in this as a sound source, okay, but that's kind of a sort of exceptional situation. But in the auditory world, you're always interested, or nearly always interested, in where the sound source is. So onsets are sudden increases in energy in some part of the spectrum. That's what makes an onset. That's what it means. In addition to that, a lot of sounds are very much in segments. Speech is impulsive, it's in little bits. You open your mouth and you get the voice signal out, you close your mouth and the sound stops. If you look at the energy in speech, it varies rapidly over 150, 100 millisecond, 200 millisecond time. And maybe we can use onsets to help divide that up. And for musical sounds, onsets give some of the character of the timbre of a note. So if you play a guitar, you get a nice fast onset at the beginning of it, and then it kind of tails off. You've got an attack, and then a decay, and then a sustain, and then eventually the sound dies away. Similarly, if you play a piano, you can get a nice fast onset. If you play a flute, the onset doesn't tend to be quite so quick. And some work that myself and Mike did some years ago suggests that that's quite important in detecting what musical instrument you're listening to, or what kind of musical instrument you're listening to. Of course, I'm not the only person that's interested in onsets. There's a nice review paper by Hu and Wang, 2007, that looks over a whole lot of different onset-based techniques, except they know the ones I was using, but never mind. They looked over a whole lot of different ones. So, the two techniques that I've used are a convolution-based technique that detects both onsets and offsets, and a depressing synapse-based technique, which is much more, as you would expect, since it uses depressing synapses, which is much more biologically inspired, but it only detects onsets. So using convolutions, we kind of started with this spike, end spike-like signal, and then we kind of downsampled it a little bit, down to about 5 milliseconds, because these spikes are coming out really at any time, depending on the rate at which you digitize the signal originally. We get a spike train per channel, and then we apply, do we use? Remember what I did? Yes. We take a downsample frequency and amplitude representation of the envelope in each band. Because when we're looking at onsets, we're interested in relatively slow, maybe 10, 20 millisecond timings of these onsets. And then we convolve that with a half difference of Gaussians, which is like the sort of thing that you do in image processing as well, when you're looking for edges. So this is a half difference of Gaussians is essentially like half a Mexican hat. So it looks a bit like that. But that's 0. And the integral of it is 0. Convolve it with that. Take the positive going side and call that the onset. Take the negative going side and call that the offset signal. And then we use that in conjunction with some leaky integrating fire neurons to essentially calculate onset spikes and offset spikes, onset times and offset times in each bandpass channel, and then use that to segment the signal. So if I look at a signal from a timid speech utterance, we bandpassed it into 100 bands, and then we calculated an onset and an offset in each of those bands. And you can kind of see that it follows the spectrogram quite nicely. In fact, we wanted to segment the sound itself, so we then have to process this multi-band onsets, and this multi-band segmented signal to pick out the actual segments of the signal. And that kind of works reasonably well. The problem with it is it's not terribly accurate. We're downsampling, first of all. It's good for breaking up the signal into segments. It's not very good for getting the beginning of an onset time down to the nearest millisecond or half millisecond, which, for reasons that I'll come to, we'd like to do sometimes. So the other technique that we used uses depressing synapses. And this is really modelled on some work by Ray Meadis' hair cell model, which is a model of the synapse and the inner hair cell itself. And what it consists of is a depressing synapse where you've got some input coming in that takes transmission, that takes transmitter from the presynaptic side into the cleft, and that then leaks away and is taken up and put back into the cleft again. So the way this works is as a set of 3 coupled first-order differential equations. I don't really want to go into this in too much depth, but basically the aim of this is to enable me to generate signals coming out from the depressing synapse, which are tied very tightly into the timing of the spikes that are coming in themselves. So if I look at what happens here, there's the original signal, halfway rectified. There's the spikes that are coming on the auditory nerve. There is the signal at the postsynaptic part of the depressing synapse, and there is the spike that gets generated by the onset neuron itself. So what I want to note here is that I can generate really quite precisely timed onset signals from these from these precisely timed auditory nerve-like signals. And we're doing this using, again, leaky integrated fire neurons. Sometimes we just take the signal from a single channel and put it in here. Sometimes we take signals from a number of adjacent channels and put them in there. Sometimes we converge the signals, and sometimes we don't. And what this gives me is the ability to pick out these quite nice onset times, which you can see fit quite well with what we have from the spectrum there. We can go, but there's a bit of complexity in here where you can either use the original spikes from the auditory nerve or you can use them in a slightly more complicated way. I don't really want to go into that. So what we did was to use these spike trays to pick up these onset signals. And what we were interested in was two things. First of all, how did the segmentation work when we were in a room that had some reverberation? And the second thing we were interested in was, could we use these onset signals and these auditory nerve signals to find the direction of our sound source in a noisy, reverberant environment? These are the two things we were interested in. So we modelled the room, and when we model the room, we can end up with signals like this. This is the raw signal.
Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
Try that again. Don't know why that's quiet.
Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
And if I add the reverberation.
Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
And of course, in here, they don't sound terribly different, because they're being played in a reverberant environment in the first place in here. So in order to hear these without the reverberation, you would need to hear them directly through a pair of headphones in order to be in an environment that didn't have reverberation. So looking at this type 1 onset-offset segmentation, there it is for the original signal. That's what it gives me. There's the same thing using the type 2 onsets. I put the two together. So this is without additional reverberation. And you can see that this segments it, and this shows you onset times reasonably well. You get additional noise in here because the onset is not an instantaneous thing. The speech doesn't suddenly come on. The speech comes on over a period inside each syllable of maybe 10, 20 milliseconds. If we add a little reverberation, you start to see that you get some smearing. The segmentation doesn't work as well because the segmentation is listening to the whole signal with the reverberation. The onsets don't work quite as well either, but they still work. The other onsets don't work quite as well, but they work reasonably well. Once you add a lot of reverberation, then the segmentation starts to not work very well at all, simply because it's all smeared out. And if you're listening to highly reverberant sounds, for example, something like a railway station, then it is very hard to make out what's being said. I suggest that this still works reasonably, but it's not working terribly well. Again, once you add a lot of reverberation, things don't work so terribly well. So, let's think then about what we can do with this, how we might use this. So most of the work I've done has been done in MATLAB on various computers over a long period of time. It's slow but nice for development. I'm waiting for a spike-based system, a neuromorphic spike-based system to turn up from Zurich. It's been on order since April, I think. They had some problems with it, but they promised me it round about the beginning of November. In addition to that, I've been working with a group at Instituto Politécnico Nacional in Mexico City who are interested in developing FPGA-based systems. I think probably... So we've written a paper now, we've got some work done on implementing a large number of channels using FPGAs to work in real time. And they're working up to 150 channels trying to make this work in real time. I don't want to go into the details of that. But the results are quite nice. They have some quite nice filter bank output here. It's not an adaptive filter bank, it's just a straightforward filter bank modeling a gamma tone type filter. And we've got some spike coding in there as well, so that's working. And we're trying to produce these onset-based implementations as well. Okay, what I want to talk more about is applying these onsets. What can we do with these? So, people are animals in general are interested in the direction that sounds come from. As I said earlier, they're interested in the direction of the sound source, not of the reflections from that sound source. And there are two cues that are used for that. One is the difference in time of arrival of the signal at the 2 ears. And the other one is the difference in the intensity of the signal at the 2 ears. And we'll use both. We'll use interoral time differences and interoral intensity differences. And the time differences are quite small. Sound travels at about 330 meters per second. If the sound is over here, let's say the source is over there, then you're looking at a difference between there to this ear and there to this ear, which is of the order of 15 centimeters or thereabouts. And if the sound is nearer straight ahead, then the difference in these path lengths will be of the order of a few centimeters. So the difference in time of arrival is measured in tens to hundreds of microseconds. So it's really quite small. And since biological systems don't generally work at that kind of speed, that suggests that they're doing something rather special in order to get that kind of accuracy. But what's this got to do with onsets, you might ask? I hear you ask, but I'm not hear you saying anything. So the answer to that is that, as I said earlier, the onset comes from the direct path. But if you're listening to me talking, you can hear the sounds coming from over here, even although most of the volume of the sound is coming reflected off the ceiling, reflected off the walls, reflected off the other chairs, etc. It's coming from all sorts of directions. But the fact that the red path, the direct path, is shorter means that it's the first one that arrives. So the direct path is what's providing the onset of the sound. So if we qualify when we calculate the interoral time difference or the interoral intensity difference by only using the onset time, then we have a chance of finding out the direction of the sound source as opposed to finding out the direction of reflections of the sound. So we've been using onset qualified cues. We haven't really looked at level difference, we haven't really done that. There's a number of reasons for that. Primary one being that really to get the level difference properly, you have to have some kind of pinna on your system rather than having an omnidirectional microphone. So it's a little bit complicated. We need to do that. So we looked at inter-microphone time difference and level difference. And what we're talking about here is implementing something which is known as the law of the first wavefront, or the precedence effect, which is this law that says that when you're working out what direction the sound comes from, what you are generally using first of all is this onset. It can be confused if the echoes come from too far away, then you hear the echo separately and you hear the direction the echo comes from as well. But in a room of this kind of size, there's not a question about it. You know I'm over here as opposed to being over there. ILD depends on microphone housing and ears and so forth, and we haven't really used that. So some of the work that we did was to use microphones on a flat panel, and we played a mixture of noise and sound. And it's quite effective. The microphones are 406 millimeters apart, which is a bit wider than an ear. We had what I was thinking of was trying to have a system that detected if the person working on, let's say, a laptop was in front of the laptop or was somewhere else. And what was in my mind was the kind of idea of having a speech-based interface. And what you wanted to avoid was somebody coming in your door and shouting, "Delete all files." We wanted to make sure that it was the person who was actually using the computer that was doing this. That was the idea, that was the kind of justification for it. We got a paper out about this some years ago now, but it works quite well. It's not wonderful. It's not wonderful because as you get to higher frequencies, then you start to have the wavelength, the period of the sound starts to be comparable with or smaller than the interoral time difference. Now, as you go up to, let's say, 3 kilohertz, the period, if you go up to 3 kilohertz, the wavelength of the sound goes down to about 10 centimeters. Is that right? Yes. Goes down to about 10 centimeters, which is comparable with the interoral, the distance between your ears. And if you go up to 3 or 4 kilohertz, then you're down to 3 or 4 centimeters, and it gets to be difficult. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that animals use interoral time difference as the primary cue for low frequencies, but interoral level difference for higher frequencies. But there is I would suggest evidence here that what they're doing is they're working at, so they're working using the onset time, using the time of onset, or onset qualification to make this work. But what else can you do with onsets? That's a nice picture of him. Less beard. So,
looks younger as well.
you look younger, you probably were younger. So, one thing that we noted was that if you take, let's say, a violin sound, or a flute sound, or a piano sound, and you cut off the beginning of it, and you just make it start off with a basic ramp up to that sound, it becomes quite difficult to work out what kind of instrument you're listening to. So we were interested in looking at the onset transient, what the sound sounds like at the onset, in order to characterize something about the musical instrument that was being played. So what Mike and I did was to look at two codings, an MFCC-based coding and an onset-based coding, and try and compare these for different kinds of instruments. So we did the same kind of thing as before. We generated the AN spike range in the same kind of way as I spoke about before. We generate the onset, we find it when the onset is, using these depressing synapses and leak it into the amplifier neurons. We get onset spikes in each channel, and we use that to calculate when the onset is. And we can then identify, there's the onset time here for this particular sound here, and there's a raw sound signal up here. You can see this is picking up when the onset is. So the onset interval, of course, is different for different instruments. I mean, if you drop a glass on a concrete floor, the onset's extremely fast. If, on the other hand, you bow a string relatively slowly, the onset is relatively slow, so it's a bit tricky. And we developed an idea, or Mike developed an idea, of an onset fingerprint, where what we did was to take these onsets and then pick out what was inside the different frequency bands during the period of that onset. And we called this the onset fingerprint. And we then tried to characterize the sound using that. So we worked with 417 brass sounds, reed sounds, bowed string sounds, plot string sounds, and struck string sounds. And then we used two different techniques. We used the spiking auditory model, and we used these MFCC type ones, and we put them into a classifier. And we compared the two. Of course, it gets a bit tricky because the classifier that you need for the onset one needs to be something that goes over time. So what we used was an echo state network, or a recurrent echo state neural network, which I'm not going to describe at the moment. It's a reasonably simple kind of neural network, and what's nice about it is that what's inside the dynamical part of it doesn't adapt. All that adapts is the outputs from it, which adapt using a simple delta rule. So that's quite nice, quite easy to work with. And then for the biomorphic technique, we have a confusion matrix, and you can see that we use the McGill dataset, which is a dataset of musical instrument sounds from McGill University in Canada, and you can see that it's reasonably good. For the base ones, it gets 78.57% correct and doesn't get them very confused. It gets some of the other ones a bit more confused. In particular, it confuses struck string with plot string. You can see these values, these off-diagonal values are relatively large. And we trained with 70% of the dataset and tested with 30%. For the MFCC technique, using just the onset, it worked just as well. Well, it actually worked better for base and slightly worse for some others, but there really wasn't a big difference between these two. If you looked at the steady state part of it, it didn't work nearly as well, in fact, nearly as well. So the whole note MFCC, there wasn't a lot of difference between these two. I think, if I remember correctly, that the onset one was marginally better, but there wasn't much difference between them. And then we thought, well, actually, all these sounds were recorded under identical conditions. And we wondered, so that meant that the reverberation, etc., was the same. But of course, we wondered, maybe what was happening was that the MFCC system was working well because all these sounds were similar in terms of what their onset looked like, in in terms of what the reverberation had done to them. So what we did was we trained them on one data set, the McGill one, and we tested them on another data set, an Iowa data set. And that gave us quite a nice surprise, because the MFCC technique based on the onsets really didn't work well at all anymore, and completely confused plucked strings and struck strings. Whereas it didn't really make any difference at all to the biomorphic technique. So there's something about the way in which it was recorded that was making a difference here. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit now at the end of this talk about what I'm doing at the moment. What I'm interested in is feature-based coding. Onsets are one kind of feature, auditory nerve spikes are another kind of sort of feature that are just a basic coding. And I'm interested in what we can do with these systems. So the motivation here is, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about these things, not very much about them, I'm kind of running out of time, I knew I had too many slides. So, on the kind of standard system, you have a coder like the MFCC coder, or any other kind of coder, and then you have a recognizer that goes with that. And the way in which it works is that you take the coder, you have a labeled training set, you train up the coder, you take the coder, you train up the recognizer on the data that comes from that coder. That gives you a recognizer, which then turns into a trained recognizer, and you use the same coder to generate the output. And in general, the complexity is in the recognizer. People are using deep neural networks, people are using hidden Markov models, all sorts of things like that. The complexity is in the recognizer, and the coder is relatively straightforward. So what I'm really thinking here is maybe if we had a bit more complexity in the coder, we might be able to work with either a slightly simpler recognizer or to get better results out of a sophisticated recognizer. So what I've been looking at is a variety of different sorts of coding. The EN vector, the onset vector, and then various spectrotemporal Gabor filters, which I'll come to in a moment. So while the EN vector contained the basic information of the spectrotemporal distribution of the sound energy, and we saw earlier that they were invertible, so they actually are holding something useful about the signal. The onset vectors are particularly handy for how the sound starts off. It's good for segmentation, it's good for finding the direction of sounds, and it seems to be good for finding out things about different sorts of musical sounds. The Gabor filters was really just an experiment coming out from what's been happening in image processing. There's your spectrotemporal Gabor filters. So this one is purely temporal, so it's got a large plus here, minus here, plus here, and that one's purely spectral, not purely, largely spectral. And you can have a mixture of spectrum and temporal that way. And you can have them varying durations, either very tight durations, very short durations like on the left, or you can have longer durations up to 100 milliseconds that we have on the right there. And we did a little bit of work on this, trying to recognize birdsong using these kinds of Gabor filters. And it's interesting, we haven't really concluded on this, but there's, you get somewhat, so these are 7 different pieces of birdsong and 8 in the different colours, and 8 different Gabor filters. And you can see there's a certain amount of difference in size of where the peaks come. Not conclusive, just suggesting that it might be useful. Another PhD student of mine, Abdul Rahman Al-Sheikh Mubarak, did some work with me looking at an Arabic data set, a data set of Arabic words, and he was comparing a number of different feature extraction techniques, MFCC, PLP, RAS-PLP, and Gabor, and looking at how these got on with as building a recognizer for Arabic sounds. With clean data, everything works fine. With white noise data at 30 decibels, then it still works quite well. 30 decibels signal to noise ratio, it still works quite well. But as you reduce the signal to noise ratio, then things, as you would expect, start to work less well. Now, Gabor doesn't work terribly well here. It works quite well at 20 decibels, but not very well otherwise. Interestingly, with babble noise, the Gabor works really quite well at 30 and 20 decibels, but not so terribly well at 10 decibels. So there's more work to be done in here. But something that's got more interesting to me recently is the idea of moving away from saying, well, I think this feature should work, or I think that feature should work, and asking, can we generate features themselves from the statistics of the sounds? Can we generate self-organized features? So your onsets and your gabors are predetermined using the cleverness or otherwise of the researchers. Can we generate features in sound? Can we find the features in sound from the statistics of the sound? So looking at the TIMIT database, we found you can take the signal over 200 milliseconds, and then you can simply look at what the first, second, third and fourth principal components look like of it. And you get differentials. You get the first one just taking the actual signal. The second one gives you a positive bit in the high frequencies and a negative bit at lower frequencies. The third one gives you a sort of spectrotemporal differential, second order. And the fourth one gives you something that I actually would have expected to come third. And you get more complex ones as you take higher order PCAs. The trouble with PCAs is that these are very general indeed. So we also thought we'd look at independent components, and there you pick out interesting bits of structure in the sound, and these could be useful features. You can see speech-like things in there, kind of rising formants and such like. So when I become, that work was done quite a while ago now, and wasn't really done on a spike-based system. So what I'm interested in is, and it was done using MATLAB and such like, using the PCA and ICA functions that you get with MATLAB. So one thing I'm interested just now in is, can we do this with a spike-based representation? So I'm taking the spike-like signals, the spike-based signals, and recoding them, because if I deal with them at the frequencies they come in at, it's too difficult, takes too slow. So I'm recoding them into maybe 1 millisecond time buckets or 2 millisecond time buckets, and then I'm using a kind of standard technique to train up a neuron to pick out the strongest characteristic statistically from that input. But that input is over time, and over frequency band. So I'm rewarding inputs that help the neuron to fire. So the neuron fires at time t, I increment those parts of the inputs that were helping it to fire, and because I'm then adjusting the weight matrix so that its modulus stays the same, that amounts to decrementing those parts that didn't help. And then if I've got to do with more than one neuron, I'm training up the first neuron, making these weights static, feeding back from that signal back into the original input signal, subtracting it, and then doing the same thing with the second neuron. And you can keep doing that with more and more neurons. This is very much work I'm doing at the moment. So there it is, looking at 160 TIMIT utterances, and you end up with some kind of interesting looking things. They don't look quite as interesting as the ICAs did or the PCAs did, and I'm not quite sure why. Most of the structure in these ones were 2 millisecond buckets, so that's 300 milliseconds altogether this way, 100 channels, is really just in the spectrum. But if I increase the bucket size to 5 milliseconds, so I'm looking over 750 milliseconds, we start to get some time structure as well. So maybe there's something more useful in there. Now I've done it for speech, done it also for some music. That's something called Monkey Speedway. You get some interesting time structure at the bottom there, but less so at 5 milliseconds. So this is work that's very much ongoing at the moment. I'm coming to realise that maybe this isn't a sensible way of doing it. What I should be looking at is something like a restricted Boltzmann machine, which is something I'd like to work on there. Put them into a restricted Boltzmann machine and then look at what the hidden units end up coding. But that's something I'm just working on just now. So to conclude, I've kind of given you a very quick tour of what I've been working on using this kind of spike-coded technique. We showed that you could rebuild the sound from it. We've shown that you can use it for onsets and picking up the time of onset of a particular sound, which is useful for finding its direction. We've shown that it can be useful for characterising different kinds of musical instruments. I've suggested but not shown that it might be useful in speech recognition and in coding sounds in general. I haven't proven that when I was working on that. At the moment, we're working our way trying to put more of this into real-time systems, either using an FPGA-based technique or using a neuromorphic technique, although these days, both of these are called neuromorphic, but where I come from, neuromorphic originally meant analog-based, but these days neuromorphic now means analog or digital, just implemented in silicon. So we're working on this, we're working to work with this neuromorphic Cochlea from Shishi Liu's group in the Institute of Neuroinformatics in Zurich. And then we're trying to work with this. We want to take this and generate these features and look at sound identification. That's all I really want to say. Questions?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Leslie. We have time for a couple of questions if anybody has anything they want to ask.
Yes.
How did you decide on the sensitivity levels for the spike?
Right. I've set the most sensitive. I've set the most sensitive ones so that they would hear quiet sounds, and then I made the difference between them either root 2 or 2 times that, and went all the way up. So there was either 3 decibels or 6 decibels between each one. Which, if you've got 16 spike trains, gives you either 48 or 96 decibels of what I call dynamic range. And I tried to set it up in such a way that the loudest one wasn't used too often, because otherwise you lose information.
Yeah.
But 96 decibels of dynamic range is reasonable. 48 is actually enough for if you're working in a lab with quiet sound. Yes?
How far off real time are you used to that question?
Well, that depends how many bands you're using, how many sensitivity levels you're using. For the coding into AN on, what is it? I'm just using a single core of a quad-core processor running at 2.4 gigahertz. It takes about 2 to 2.5 times real time. For calculating the onsets, it takes ages. Probably 30th or 40th of real time. Obviously, I'm working in MATLAB. I'm not a bad MATLAB programmer, but I'm not a good MATLAB programmer, so it's reasonable. You know, I go and look at profiles and try and make sure that I'm not spending far too long doing silly things. But it's quite slow in MATLAB. They had no trouble at all getting it up to real time on FPGAs. And obviously, an analog implementation is going to be. Yes?
You plotted before the neuron as a kind of as a system. Is because you drew a triangle, like I think of gain, but is it just a simple system, or is it some kind of complex system that takes all the impulses going into it and produces an output?
I'm not quite understanding your question.
So how do you model the neuron? The effect?
It's a leaky integrated fire neuron, standard leaky. And the neuron, the synapses are three reservoir synapses, which is a fairly standard way of modeling either a depressing or a facilitating synapse. And the neurons themselves are absolutely plain single compartment leaky integrating fire neurons. So you've got these sort of dA by dt equals minus tau A plus the input that goes into it. So they're standard. Not even the Zikovich neurons. Really simple, straightforward neurons. Yes?
Do you know any reason why the MFCC model did particularly worse when you tried it with a different data set, whereas your one?
Well, I don't know the reason for that. I think it was picking, what it had been trained, what it was picking up related to the exact way in which the sound was recorded, which is to say they were all recorded in the same way, I suspect in the same room, with the same room acoustics, etc. I can't prove that.
So, but did you listen to the different data sets themselves? Can you tell? Was there any
Yeah, well,
audible difference you could hear?
Yes, there was an audible difference you could hear. Kind of hard to be precise. It's a bit of the difference you might hear between playing, say, a fiddle, a violin note in here and playing it out in the corridor.
Right.
You know,
Really
they both sound like violins, but there's a difference in the sound that you get. Yeah?
So, in the musical examples, you were just looking at single instrument playing, is that right?
Yes, it was simple, single notes of single instrument.
Monophonic.
What?
Yes, single notes.
Single note of
Yeah.
single instrument. It was the simplest possible experiment you could imagine.
Have you had a little go at what happens if you have a piano playing 2 notes?
No.
Okay.
It's a short answer to that. But, I mean, we'd love to, but this man here got a job over here doing something else. I lost him. And then I had a different grant doing something a little bit different. I mean, I'm very interested in what happens. I quite agree with you that this becomes very interesting where you have multiple different sounds. And indeed, I've looked in the past at detecting onsets in, say, guitar music. And of course, on a guitar, you've got 6 strings and you're playing multiple sounds simultaneously. On a piano, you've got, well, not 88 strings, you've got more than that. You've got 88 notes, but you don't usually play all 88 at once. But even then, you're often playing a number of them simultaneously, either as chords or over a short period of time. So yes, it would be interesting to do. And of course, you've also got lots and lots of additional reverberations and sounds, etc. on the piano. That's why we stuck with single notes. It would be easy to have flutes, oboes, not cellos, flutes, oboes, and trumpets, etc. Things that play one note at a time. And there's a lot of subtlety and possibilities in there, yes.
Can I just ask one question, Leslie, which is about your statistical approach you talked about at the end. Is there any way that research on, I don't know, learning in mammalian species at a neural level can inform how you might choose to build your starter vectors for that kind of system?
Well, you could look at what the...
well, even in terms of how what we know about the process of learning in mammalian hearing.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, the brainstem is a bit different from the cortex. And the brainstem gets trained up fairly early on. And if you look at what happens, the auditory nerve, the first port of call in there is the cochlear nucleus, the dorsal and the ventral cochlear nucleus. And then it goes from there to quite a number of other centres in the brainstem. And that's quite different from what happens in vision. In vision, the signal goes from the retina into the lateral geniculate nucleus and then directly to the cortex. So there's a whole lot more happens to the auditory signal. I'm not aware of much research on the nature of adaptation in the brainstem. What I am aware of is lots of research on what the receptive spectrotemporal receptive fields for neurons in the cochlea and in the cochlear nucleus and higher up looks like. And that gives you some ideas of what you might do. And you get things like chopper neurons and pauser neurons that respond to particular sorts of input. The experiments for doing that are really difficult though, because you have to work with usually with cat or chinchilla or something like that. To get to the brainstem is very hard. You're working with anaesthetised animals in the first place, so that's going to change things. So it's difficult to get that kind of information. It's difficult to know where to start from.
Have you seen Ray Medis' thing he's working on at the moment?
Which one?
He has that big simulation system with all the different kinds of neurons in it that are all kind of ordered.
I've seen bits of it, yes.
Anyway,
yeah.
We should talk about that.
Yeah, we should talk about that. And the last time I saw Ray Medis, he was actually working on hearing aids.
Yeah, he was talking about that last weeks ago.
I didn't see that.
Yeah. Okay, I think at that point we'll say thank you very much, Leslie. Thank you.